Chapter 1. The Shadow of the Anvil. The breath of the forge was the first thing Thomas had ever known, and he was sure it would be the last. It was older than the village, older than the mountains on the horizon, and certainly older than his own grimy 12-year-old self. This breath lived in the rhythmic sigh of the great leather bellows, in the hungry roar of the fire devouring coal, and in the hiss of hot metal plunged into the quenching trough. For Thomas, it wasn't just noise. It was a language. The day began before the first rooster remembered its duty. His father, Bjorn, would rise in the pre-dawn gloom, moving through their small home with the silent deliberation of a bear. He didn't say, "Wake up." He would simply open the door to the forge, letting its cold spirit, smelling of yesterday's ash, drift into the house. That smell was a better alarm clock than any rooster's crow. Today's work was important and simple. The plowshare from their neighbor Gregor's plow had been worn down by the rocky soil of their land. Without a sharp blade, the earth wouldn't yield. Without tilled earth, there would be no harvest. Bjorn never said it out loud, but Thomas knew. What he held in the fire wasn't just iron. It was bread for Gregor's family for the year to come. "Breathe," his father grunted over his shoulder. It was his usual command. Thomas threw his whole body into the long wooden handle that worked the bellows. Up, down, up, down. His thin shoulders ached with a familiar rhythm. At first the bellows responded reluctantly, with a creak and a sleepy groan. But soon the boy's dance found its tempo, and the leather lungs inhaled deeply, sending a powerful stream of air into the heart of the forge. The coals inside stirred, red veins glowing brighter and brighter until they burned with a furious, almost white light. Bjorn stood at the forge like a priest at an altar. He didn't look at his son. His gaze was locked on the fire and the metal lying in the center. He was a man forged in this very same smithy, quiet, hard as well-tempered steel, and coated in layers of soot like an ancient secret. His hands, gnarled like tree roots, knew more about iron than any scholar knew about God. They could feel its mood, its exhaustion, its readiness to yield. "Tongs," he commanded. And Thomas, without breaking his dance at the bellows, darted to the wall, grabbed the right tool, and placed it on the edge of the anvil. His father snatched the plowshare from the fire. For a moment, a blinding light filled the forge. The metal sang. It was alive and malleable. The very first hammer blow on the anvil sounded like a crack of thunder, shaking the tools on the walls. Bam! A shower of golden sparks flew up toward the soot-blackened beams. For a split second, Thomas froze, mesmerized by the fireworks. He had seen it 1,000 times, but the spectacle never lost its magic. "Breathe!" His father's roar snapped him back to reality. Thomas flinched. Lost in the moment, he had broken his rhythm, and the white flame in the forge had already begun to turn yellow. His father had noticed instantly, with just a glance. He didn't scold. He didn't yell. He just looked at his son as if he had committed a betrayal, as if he had allowed the very heart of their world to grow cold. Shame burned Thomas hotter than any fire. He threw his weight into the handle with renewed force, and the forge roared back to life, finding its proper fury. Bjorn worked. His hammer didn't just strike, it sculpted. Each blow was measured, precise, and had its purpose. One shaped the cutting edge, another strengthened the body of the plowshare, a third flattened the surface. It was a song, rough, but filled with incredible power. And Thomas, pumping the bellows, was an essential part of it. He was the wind that fanned the flames. He was the breath of the song. When the work was nearly done, Bjorn plunged the plowshare into the trough of water. Steam erupted with a deafening hiss, swallowing the blacksmith in a cloud of white. When it cleared, he held a renewed plowshare, dark, matte, its sharpened edge gleaming in the gloom. He silently handed it to his son. It was a sign of trust. Thomas took it. It was still warm and smelled of ozone and power. The boy ran a finger along the edge, sharp as a razor. He tapped it with a knuckle. The sound was clear and ringing. It was good work. Perfect. "Take it to Gregor," his father said, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. It was all the praise Thomas could ever expect, but to him it meant the world. His father had trusted him to deliver the result of their shared labor. Stepping out of the forge's twilight into the sun-drenched village street, Thomas squinted. The world out here was different. It smelled of fresh hay, livestock, and baking bread. It was filled with the shouts of children chasing a rag ball by the well and the laughter of women hanging laundry. Thomas saw boys his own age. Their hands were clean, their faces carefree. They lived in this simple, understandable world. But he was an inhabitant of another realm, a kingdom of fire and iron. Sometimes he wished he were one of them, but then he'd remember the magic of glowing metal, and that thought would seem small and bland. Later, as the day began to fade, the village elder Henrik stopped by the forge. He didn't have an order. His face, usually rosy and cheerful, was grave. "Bjorn," he began, taking off his cap. "News from the castle. Baron Alfred has passed away 2 days ago." A silence fell over the forge, broken only by the crackle of cooling embers. The old baron had been a stern but fair ruler. He had ruled these lands as long as Thomas could remember. His passing meant change. They say his son, Kalan, is already on his way to claim his lands. No one really knows him. They say he's young, served at the king's court. They say he has different ways. Bjorn said nothing. He picked up his hammer and placed it in its spot on the workbench. Then he did the same with the tongs and chisels. His movements were slow, almost ritualistic. He was putting his world in order, as if trying to shield it from the chaos encroaching from the outside. After the elder had left, Thomas dared to break the silence. "Father, is it bad that there will be a new lord?" Bjorn stared for a long time into the dying heart of the forge, where red embers still glowed like the eyes of a sleeping beast. In the fading light, his face looked like a mask carved from granite. "Change isn't good or bad. It just is. And our job is to forge what is needed. Whether it's a plowshare for a farmer or a sword for a lord, the iron doesn't choose its master." He turned and walked out, leaving Thomas alone. He looked at the wall where horseshoes, hinges, and nails hung, the fruits of their daily labor. It all seemed eternal and unshakable, but today, for the first time, he felt that the shadow of their anvil, so familiar and comforting, might not be the only one they would have to live under. From the west, from the direction of the Baron's castle, a different shadow was falling, one that was far longer and far more unpredictable.
Chapter 2: The Iron Gaze. The week after the news of the old Baron's death stretched on like an untempered strip of iron under a heavy hammer, slow and tense. The village, usually living by the steady rhythm of sowing and reaping, buzzed like a disturbed beehive. Women fetching water from the well whispered longer than usual. Men, gathering at the tavern in the evening, spoke not of the weather or the harvest, but of taxes, laws, and the ways of the city nobility. The word change, spoken by Bjorn in the dim forge, now hung in the very air, thick and palpable. Every day, as Thomas worked the bellows, he listened to the road. Every clatter of wheels, every distant whinny made his heart beat faster. He imagined the new lord, sometimes as an old grizzled warrior in dented armor, other times as a pampered youth in silks and velvets. His father, however, seemed deaf and blind to everything beyond the forge's threshold. He worked with a doubled, almost furious diligence. His hammer rang from morning till night, forging nails, staples, hinges, simple, honest things that had no room for uncertainty. It was as if he was trying to drown out the anxious hum of the outside world with its rhythm. Then one day, with the midday sun high in the sky, the world exploded with the barking of dogs. Thomas peeked out the door. A procession appeared at the far end of the street. It was unlike anything he had ever seen. Not the creaking cart of a merchant, not pilgrims in dusty robes. At the front rode two horsemen in polished steel helmets, their lances, with narrow pennons tied to them, looking like the teeth of a predatory fish. Behind them, the Lord himself, Sir Callan. He rode a black stallion, its harness adorned with silver plaques. The Lord was young, as they said, about 25. He wasn't wearing battle armor, but a traveling suit of expensive dark blue cloth, yet he sat in the saddle with the confidence of a man born to it. He had a narrow, determined face, a clean-shaven chin, and piercing gray eyes that seemed not just to look, but to weigh and assess everything they fell upon. Beside him, a man in a scribe's robes trotted on a mule, a scribal kit strapped to his saddle. 4 more armed footmen brought up the rear. The village froze. Women hid in their houses, men respectfully doffed their caps. The procession moved slowly down the street, and Sir Callan's cold, sharp gaze swept over the houses, the fences, the faces of the people. He didn't smile, but he didn't frown either. His face was an impenetrable mask of authority. "The forge," he said, and his voice, quiet but commanding, carried in the sudden silence. His horse stopped right in front of Thomas's workplace. Bjorn emerged from the gloom. He didn't wipe his hands or bow any lower than common courtesy required. He simply stood on the threshold of his world, large, grimy, smelling of smoke and sweat, and met the new master's gaze. For a moment, they looked at each other. The man of earth, fire, and iron, and the man of power, ambition, and a new order. "Are you Bjorn, the blacksmith?" Sir Callan asked. "I am," his father answered shortly. The lord dismounted with the grace of a predator. His fine leather boots were absurdly clean against the packed earth, sprinkled with coal dust. Without waiting for an invitation, he stepped inside. His eyes, accustomed to the light, narrowed for a moment, adjusting to the dimness. "Solid," he said, his gaze sweeping over the soot-blackened walls, the bundles of stock, the rows of tools. But there was no praise in his voice. It was the word of an appraiser stating a fact. Crude, but solid. He walked over to the wall where the finished products hung. He picked up a horseshoe, weighed it in his hand. Good balance, but the curve of the heel could be more elegant. In the capital, they make them rounder. It's less damaging to the cobblestones. Bjorn remained silent. Only the muscles in his jaw tightened. Thomas, hiding by the bellows, felt a knot of indignation tighten in his stomach. Who was this fop to teach his father, the best craftsman, for 3 days' journey round? Sir Callan seemed oblivious to the tension. He walked to the anvil and ran his finger over its smooth, polished surface. "Spanish steel?" he asked, and there was so much knowledge in that question that Thomas was taken aback. "From Toledo," his father ground out. The late Baron brought it back from a campaign." "I thought so," the Lord nodded. "They have a particular ring. An appreciation for a good tool is the first sign of a master. However, the tool is only half the battle. The other half is imagination." He turned and looked Bjorn straight in the eye. "Your work is strong, it's honest, it has the strength of the earth, but it has no fire, no flair. You make what is meant to serve. I, on the other hand, am looking for those who can make what will be admired." Thomas expected his father to explode, to say something sharp, to throw the insolent man out, but Bjorn remained as still as a rock. "Admiration won't feed a family, my lord. A good plowshare will." Sir Calin smirked for the first time. It was a cold smirk that didn't reach his eyes. "You're mistaken, blacksmith. Admiration breeds fame. Fame breeds commissions, and large commissions from wealthy men feed a family far better than 100 plowshares for your neighbors. I plan to rebuild the castle. I will need grates, light fixtures, gates, and I will pay in silver, not gratitude. But I need to know what you're capable of." He turned to his scribe. "Pen and paper." The little man nimbly hopped off his mule and handed the lord his writing materials. Sir Calin, resting the paper on his knee, sketched something with a few quick, precise strokes. "I need a lock for my treasury box," he said, holding the sketch out to Bjorn. Thomas peeked over his father's shoulder. On the paper was not just a key. Its bow was shaped like the head of a hawk, the sigil of the Calin family. The details were incredibly fine: the feathers, the predatory curve of the beak, the eye. The lock mechanism itself, judging by the diagram, was also complex, with a double bit and several internal pins. This was a job for a jeweler, not a village blacksmith. "This is," Bjorn began. "This is a test," the Lord interrupted him. "I want to see not only strength, but precision. Not only the power of your hand, but the sharpness of your eye. Do this, and you'll get a commission your ancestors could only dream of. Fail, and I'll send for a master from the capital. And rest assured, I'll find a use for him, but whether I'll find one for you—" He left the sentence unfinished, but the threat hung in the air, as heavy as a blacksmith's hammer. "A week. I'll send for the lock in a week." He turned, and without another word, walked out of the forge, swung into his saddle, and rode away. His retinue followed, and just as quickly as it had appeared, the procession vanished, leaving behind only dust on the road and a ringing silence. The village slowly came back to life, but in the forge, it was quiet. Bjorn stood motionless, staring at the piece of paper in his hand. His huge, powerful body seemed tense to the breaking point. He looked at the elegant drawing of the hawk, and Thomas saw a storm in his father's eyes. This wasn't just a difficult commission. It was a challenge, direct, arrogant, and humiliating. A challenge to everything Bjorn believed in and lived by. His world of simple, honest things had been slapped in the face by a world of elegant trifles, a world of whims and ostentatious luxury. Finally, his father clenched his fist, crumpling the paper. But then, with a heavy sigh, he slowly unclenched his fingers and carefully smoothed the sheet out on the edge of the anvil. He said nothing. He simply walked to the forge, took his tongs, and threw a piece of the finest steel, saved for special occasions, into the embers. Then he turned to Thomas. His gaze was heavier than ever. "Fire," he said, a single word. "Give me a white fire, the kind this village has never seen." And Thomas understood. The challenge had been accepted, and from that moment on, their lives had changed forever.
Chapter 3. The Impossible Commission. The week Sir Calin had given them transformed the forge into something like an alchemist's cell. The familiar clang of the heavy hammer beating raw strength out of metal was replaced by an almost reverent silence, broken only by thin, ringing sounds. Bjorn had postponed all other orders, Plowshares, horseshoes, sickles, the entire village life that depended on his craft was put on hold. On the anvil, usually cluttered with massive blanks, now lay a single small bar of the finest steel, and it seemed to absorb all the attention, all the light, and all the air in the room. The work began not with fire, but with charcoal and files. To Thomas's surprise, Bjorn first set about making new tools. "For small fish, you need a fine net," he muttered to himself, and it was the longest sentence Thomas had heard from him in the past 2 days. His huge hands, accustomed to the handle of a sledgehammer, moved with incredible precision. He forged tiny chisels the size of Thomas's fingernail, miniature tongs capable of holding a red-hot nail, and a series of files with different cuts, from coarse to almost velvety. Watching this, Thomas began to understand. The Lord's challenge had touched not just his pride, it had touched his very essence as a master craftsman. His father wasn't just going to make a lock, he was going to show the upstart from the capital what true ancestral craftsmanship was, capable of conquering metal in any of its forms. Thomas was given a new role. Now his task was not to fan a furious flame, but to maintain a steady, even heat in a small, portable forge that his father used for tempering knives. He had to feel the fire with his fingertips, adding coals one by one, aiming not for a white, but a gentle straw-colored glow, perfect for working with small details. "Don't breathe on it, whisper to it. It should warm, not burn," Bjorn taught him. They worked on the body of the lock. Bjorn cut the plates, fitting them together with such precision that a human hair couldn't pass between them. Then he began to work his magic on the mechanism. He filed pins, springs, levers, details so small that Thomas had to hold his breath, afraid of blowing them off the workbench. The most difficult test was the key. Making a double bit that perfectly matched the pins was only half the battle. The main challenge was the hawk's head. Bjorn tried several times to sketch it on a piece of slate, but his hand, accustomed to sweeping motions, produced only rough, clumsy silhouettes. He erased them with a fury, and a heavy, oppressive silence hung in the forge. On the evening of the 3rd day, when Bjorn in despair had gone into the house, Thomas gathered his courage. He had spent his childhood drawing with charcoal on the barn walls, birds, trees, animals. He took a piece of charcoal and on a clean board he had brought from home began to draw. He remembered the hawk he had seen on a hunt with the old baron, its proud profile, its hooked beak, its fierce, all-seeing eye. His fingers moved quickly and confidently. When Bjorn returned, he found his son at this task. Thomas froze, fearing his father's anger, but Bjorn silently approached, took the board, and for a long time, without taking his eyes off it, looked at the drawing. It wasn't just a bird. It had character, it had life, it had that same predatory grace that the Lord demanded. Again, his father ordered curtly, only smaller, on this piece of copper. He gave Thomas a thin copper plate and a sharp stylus. All night, by the light of a tallow candle, Thomas transferred his drawing to the metal, scratching fine lines. His father sat beside him, watching in silence, and this silence was not oppressive but supportive. For the first time, they were not master and apprentice, but two creators bent over the same task. Using the copper template, Bjorn began to work his magic. He heated the tip of the steel key, and with tiny hammers, with a light tap-tap-tapping like a woodpecker, he shaped it. Then he took his new chisels and files and began to carve. He cut away the excess, working on each feather, each curve.
It was as if he was freeing the bird trapped inside the metal. On the seventh day, everything was ready. The lock, small but heavy, lay on a piece of clean leather. Its surface was polished to a dark matte sheen. The key lay beside it. The hawk on its bow seemed alive. It was as if it was looking at you with its cold metal eye. Bjorn inserted the key into the keyhole. There was a soft, precise click. He turned it again. A second click. The mechanism worked like a clock. At noon sharp, the same horseman who had come with the Lord stopped at the forge. He silently accepted the package with the lock, nodded, and rode away. The day passed in anticipation. Bjorn couldn't find a place for himself, pacing from corner to corner, which was completely unlike him. In the evening, the messenger returned. He said, "Sir Kalen is pleased. He has ordered the blacksmith Bjorn and his son to appear at the castle tomorrow morning." The next morning, washed and dressed in their best, albeit smoke-scented clothes, they set off. The castle, which Thomas had only seen from a distance, was huge up close. The courtyard was bustling with activity. Stonemasons were dressing blocks for a new wall, carpenters were fitting rafters. The air was filled with noise, shouts, and the smell of fresh wood and lime mortar. Everything here spoke of ambition and change. They were led into a large hall where Sir Kalen, standing at a huge table, was examining some papers. "Ah, here are my masters," he said, looking up. "I must admit, Bjorn, I'm impressed, very impressed. There is more art in your hands than I supposed." He nodded at the box on the table. Their lock adorned it. "But that was just a trial run, a prelude. Now I will show you the real music." He gestured to a servant who unrolled a huge scroll of parchment on the table. Thomas gasped. It was a blueprint, the blueprint for the main gates of the castle. They were incredible. Two massive gates woven from hundreds of metal rods that twisted like living vines, forming the most intricate pattern. Woven into these vines were hunting scenes. Here a boar pierced by a spear, there a deer frozen in mid-leap, here a pack of hounds chasing a fox. And in the center of it all, on each gate was a huge, detailed coat of arms of the Kalen family, topped with a crown. Thomas couldn't take his eyes off it. This wasn't just a craft, it was a poem frozen in iron, a legend that you could touch with your hands. He felt a fire igniting in his chest, as hot as the one in their forge. To make something like this, to be a part of it. "The scale is 4 cubits high, 3 wide for each gate," Kalen explained matter-of-factly, tracing a finger over the blueprint. "The best iron, bronze inlays for the coat of arms. A year's work, maybe 2, but the pay will be royal. You'll be able to rebuild your house, hire 3 apprentices, and never have to think about mending plows for the rest of your days. You will make a name for yourself, blacksmith." He looked expectantly at Bjorn. Thomas also turned to his father, his face shining with delight. He expected his father to proudly puff out his chest, beat it, and accept this greatest of commissions. But what he saw frightened him. Bjorn was as pale as a sheet. His hands, usually as steady as a rock, were trembling slightly. He looked at the blueprint not with admiration, but with horror, as if it were not a dream but a nightmare. His gaze was fixed on the intricate tracery at the top of the gates. "No," he whispered. The whisper was hoarse, choked. "What?" Sir Kalen didn't understand. "No!" Bjorn shouted, louder this time. He took a step back from the table as if it were burning him. "I won't do it." "You dare to refuse?" Steel entered the Lord's voice. "This is not a blacksmith's work. This is pride," Bjorn forced out, struggling for words. Iron doesn't like this. It doesn't forgive when you try to make a spider's web out of it. It takes revenge." Sir Callan laughed coldly. "I'm not paying for your philosophy, but for your skill. Are you afraid, blacksmith? Afraid you can't handle it? Well, that's your right. I'll find someone who isn't afraid."
Thomas looked from his father to the Lord to the mesmerizing blueprint. He didn't understand. Why? Why was his father refusing a dream? "Father, but we can do it," he blurted out. "This is—" "Silence!" Bjorn cut him off in a tone so icy that Thomas had never heard it before. He grabbed his son by the shoulder and, without another word, almost dragged him out of the hall. They walked back to the village in complete silence. But this silence was ringing. It was filled with the crash of Thomas's shattered hopes and the dull echo of his father's fear. The boy didn't dare to look up. He could feel Bjorn's firm grip on his shoulder was not just a manifestation of anger, but a desperate attempt to hold on to something simple and understandable in this world that had suddenly become too complicated. Today, it wasn't just a shadow that had fallen between them. It was a chasm, and at the bottom of it lay the beautiful and impossible blueprint of the gates, like an unattainable dream.
Chapter 4. Whispers from the Past. The return from the castle felt like plunging into cold, viscous water. The air in the forge, once filled with the thick smell of coal and metal, now seemed saturated with a heavy, oppressive silence. Bjorn didn't say a word. He took off his formal shirt, put his leather apron back on, and with a fury bordering on despair, threw himself into his work. But this wasn't the mindful, creative work of before. He wasn't forging plowshares or locks. He was taking scrap iron, heating it white-hot, and with a deafening crash, hammering it into formless slabs, which he then hurled into a corner. He wasn't creating, he was annihilating. He was unleashing the storm that raged inside him onto the iron, and every hammer blow was a scream he couldn't let out. Thomas tried to speak to him several times. "Father, that blueprint!" "Quiet!" Bjorn would cut him off, not even looking at him. "But why? We could have—" "I said quiet!" he roared so loudly that Thomas flinched. In his father's voice, there wasn't just anger, but raw, primal fear. "Get to work. Sort the nails." Sorting nails. After seeing the blueprint for the gates, this work felt not just humiliating, it felt meaningless. Their entire world, which just yesterday had seemed so vast and important, had shrunk to the size of a crate of rusty fasteners. The wall of silence his father had built was stronger than any castle battlement. Desperate to get through to Bjorn, Thomas turned to his last ally, his mother. Elspeth was a woman as quiet as a summer evening. She was the water that always seemed to quench the flames of her husband's temper, smoothing the sharp edges of his character. He found her in the house, mending his work shirt. "Mother, what's wrong with him?" Thomas asked, sitting on the bench across from her. "I've never seen him like this. He's afraid." Elspeth sighed, setting aside her sewing. Her eyes, the same gray as Bjorn's, but full of warmth instead of steel, looked at her son with sympathy. "Your father, he wasn't always like this," she began slowly, choosing her words. "When we were married, he was different. Loud, quick to laugh. He dreamed of great things. He used to say he would make iron sing." "So what happened?" Thomas pressed. "Life happened, son. The city of Weissenberg happened." He had never heard the name before. "Weissenberg?" "Yes, he went there as an apprentice when he was a little older than you, to the best master in the land, Otto Baumann. Master Otto was an artist. He believed you could make anything from iron. Your father worshipped him. Together they won the commission to decorate the new town hall. It was supposed to be the work of their lives." She fell silent.
her gaze lost in the distance. And then there was the great fire and a broken promise. When your father came back from there, something in him had been extinguished. The fire that burned in his soul was left only in the forge. He swore he would never again try to make iron sing, only serve. He believes a master's pride is a great sin. But what fire? What promise? I can't tell you more, Thomas, she said firmly. That's a story he has to tell you himself, if he can. Just know this, his fear is not cowardice. It's a scar on his soul that still hurts. His mother's words didn't clarify, but they pointed the way. Weissenberg, Master Otto, the Great Fire. These scraps of information became keys for Thomas, not to a lock, but to the mystery surrounding his father. He knew who to ask for guidance. Father Matthias, the village priest, was old and wise. He had served in their little church for 40 years and remembered every villager as a child. Thomas found him in the small garden behind the church tending his roses. "Father," the boy began, "may I ask you about the past?" The priest turned, a kind smile lighting up his wrinkled face. "The past is the one thing old men have in abundance. Ask, my child." "Do you remember when my father was young, before he went to Weissenberg?" The priest's eyes clouded over with memories for a moment. "Oh yes, I remember Bjorn, a talented boy, restless. His hands reached for a hammer like a flower reaches for the sun. And when he returned, he was different, quiet, withdrawn, as if he was carrying a heavy burden. Do you know what happened in Weissenberg? My mother spoke of a fire." "Yes, the news reached us even here," Father Matthias nodded, his expression growing serious. "A terrible tragedy. They were working on a wrought iron spire for the town hall, an incredible lace-like structure. They said the scaffolding caught fire one night. The flames spread to the roof. The spire, red hot, collapsed into the building. Master Otto, trying to save his blueprints, was badly hurt. He survived, but he was crippled, blinded in one eye, and his hand was mangled. For a blacksmith, that's a death sentence." "And my father?" Thomas asked, his heart sinking. "Bjorn, thank God, was unharmed. He came home a month later. People said different things. Some that he got scared and ran. Others that he was cast out like an apprentice who brought bad luck. But I think he simply couldn't stay there and see his master broken. His heart was broken." Now the picture was starting to become clear. His father's fear was the fear of repetition. He saw the ghost of that collapsed spire in Sir Kalen's blueprint. Meanwhile, life in the village went on, but under new rules. Sir Kalen began rebuilding the castle with gusto. Workers flocked from all the surrounding areas. The most prominent among them was Lars, the foreman of the stonemasons. He was a huge, red-bearded man with a booming voice and hands like two boulders. He quickly found favor with the new lord. One day, walking back from the market, Thomas witnessed an unpleasant scene. Lars, surrounded by his workers, was boasting loudly in the square. "Sir Kalen says my carved stone portal will be the jewel of the castle," he bellowed. "Not like some blacksmiths who only had the nerve to make a lock for a box, but when it came to real work, they hid in their hole." One of the stonemasons laughed. "They say Bjorn was afraid the hammer for a job like that would be too heavy for his old hands." "It's not about the hands, it's about the spirit," Lars thundered, noticing Thomas. "His spirit has gone out like damp coal. All he can do is patch old pots. Great works are for us, the stonemasons. We work with eternal stone, not rusty iron." Thomas flushed with shame and anger. He wanted to shout at them and tell them they didn't understand that his father was a great master, but the words stuck in his throat. He just silently clenched his fists and walked away,
the sound of mocking laughter echoing behind him. The Lord's pressure became more and more palpable. It wasn't direct. Sir Callan was too smart for brute force. It was just that one day, the stableman from the castle, who always had his horses shod by Bjorn, rode to the next village. Then the carpenters repairing the castle wall needed staples and nails. A messenger was sent elsewhere for those too. The small but steady jobs that formed the basis of their income dried up. Bjorn pretended not to notice, but Thomas saw. He saw his mother counting the copper coins in her purse, saw her mending their clothes that would have been replaced once. He saw new, bitter lines appearing on his father's face. Pride wouldn't let him admit defeat, but the shadow of poverty was already falling on their doorstep. One evening, after his father was asleep, Thomas snuck into the forge. It was cold and quiet. Moonlight, filtering through the single window, fell on the cold anvil. This place, which had always been a source of strength and magic for him, now felt dead. The fire hadn't just gone out in his father's soul, it was leaving their forge as well. Thomas walked to the wall. He looked at the perfect lock for the box, hanging in a place of honor, like a mockery. He remembered the mesmerizing blueprint of the gates, Lars's cruel laughter, and his mother's tired eyes. And in that moment, his childish shame for his father was replaced by a firm resolution. He was no longer just a confused boy. He was a son, watching his father be devoured by the past and his family by poverty. He didn't know how, but he had to do something. He had to get to the bottom of the tragedy in Weissenberg, not to condemn his father, but to understand him, to find a way to rekindle the fire in his eyes and in the heart of their forge. He placed his palm on the cold steel of the anvil and made a silent vow. He would learn the whole truth,
and he would make the iron sing again.
Chapter 5. The Mystery in the Ashes. The determination that had seized Thomas in the cold, moonlit forge didn't evaporate with the morning mist. It hardened inside him, becoming a solid, sharp core. He began his secret investigation. By day, he was the dutiful apprentice, quietly sorting nails and working the bellows for the rare jobs that came in, lulling his father's suspicions. But the moment Bjorn, worn out by idleness and heavy thoughts, went back to the house, the forge became Thomas's hunting ground. He searched everywhere. He dug through old barrels, peering under mountains of rusted iron his grandfather and father had kept with a just-in-case mentality. He tapped every stone in the floor, hoping to find a hidden compartment. He even climbed into the rafters beneath the roof, risking his neck, searching every beam coated in a sticky, decades-old layer of soot. But it was all for nothing. The forge kept its secrets as securely as Bjorn kept his. Despair began to creep in. Maybe he had imagined it all. Maybe there was no relic from the past, only the fear living in his father's soul. He was ready to give up when his gaze fell upon the farthest, darkest corner of the forge. There, behind a cold hearth that hadn't been lit in years, was a mountain of old ash and coal dust. It was a place where the waste of the blacksmith's craft had been shoveled for decades. A useless, dirty, forgotten place. And that's precisely why it was perfect. Waiting until his parents were sound asleep, he crept into the forge with a shovel and a dim lantern. The air was stale and smelled of damp earth. He began to dig. Dust filled his nose and lungs, covering him from head to toe in a black film. The work was hard and filthy. He hit old, discarded pieces of metal several times, tossed aside as failures. But he kept going, driven by a stubborn gut feeling. And then, just as he was about to lose hope, his shovel struck something hard. The sound was dull, wooden. Thomas's heart hammered against his ribs. He dropped the shovel and started digging through the ash with his bare hands. From the darkness, the corner of an old wooden chest, bound with blackened iron straps, began to appear. It was heavy. With immense effort, Thomas dragged it to the center of the forge. The chest was secured with a massive lock. But that didn't stop Thomas. The week he'd spent watching his father work on the new lock for the Lord had not been for nothing. He wasn't a master, but he was an observant student. He took a piece of stiff wire, flattened the end with a small hammer, and, holding his breath, inserted it into the keyhole. It felt like a blind and desperate prayer. He moved the wire, listening for the faintest sounds, trying to feel the invisible pins, to memorize their positions. His fingers fumbled, and sweat dripped into his eyes. But he returned to the task again and again, remembering his father's focused face. And then, suddenly, there was a soft but distinct click. Then another. The lock gave way. With trembling hands, he threw back the heavy lid. A bitter smell of fire and old grief wafted out from within. At the bottom, wrapped in a piece of coarse burlap, lay the artifact, the ghost from the past. It was a piece of forged metal, a fragment of something that had once been beautiful. Thomas recognized the style, elegant, intertwining stems and leaves, even more delicate than the work in Sir Keelan's drawing. But this beauty had been mutilated. One side was covered in ugly, swollen bubbles, as if the metal itself had boiled. The other was twisted in an unnatural, pain-filled break. Next to it lay another object, a leather-bound book, its edges badly burned. Thomas carefully opened it. It was a sketchbook. Dozens of pages filled with drawings of fantastical creatures, intricate latticework, and incredible patterns. On the first page, in calligraphic script, was written, "Sketchbook of Ideas, Otto Baumann, Master Blacksmith." Thomas understood everything. This was it, the proof. He didn't hide his discovery. He didn't wait for morning. With grim determination, he lifted the heavy chest and carried it into the house. He placed it in the middle of the table where his parents had just finished their meager dinner. Bjorn and Elspeth looked up at him surprised. Thomas silently opened the lid. His father's reaction was terrifying. As soon as his eyes fell on the mangled piece of metal, his entire body went rigid. His face turned ashen gray. He jumped to his feet so violently that the bench behind him crashed to the floor. Where did you get this?" he rasped. "In the forge, in the ash pit," Thomas answered quietly. "Don't you dare! Don't you dare touch it! Throw it out! Burn it!" Bjorn screamed, his voice a mix of fury and panic. Elspeth rushed to her husband, placing her hand on his shoulder. "Bjorn, calm down. It's time." "No!" He pushed her away. He stared at his son with wild eyes. "You don't know what you've done. You've unleashed a curse." "I want to understand." Thomas's voice grew stronger. He was no longer afraid. "I want to understand why we're starving, why you're afraid of the work that could make us famous, why you gave up. I found this, Father. Now you have to tell me, not as a master to an apprentice, but as a father to his son." A heavy silence fell. Bjorn breathed heavily, his gaze darting from the chest to his son, to his wife. Finally, as if all the air had been let out of him,
He collapsed back onto the bench and buried his face in his hands. His broad shoulders began to shake. Elspeth sat beside him, putting her arm around him. And then Bjorn began to speak. His voice was muffled, broken, and the words poured out of him in a bitter flood, as if a dam that had held for years had finally burst. "Master Otto, he was like a father to me," he began. "He believed in me, believed I would become the best, and I betrayed him. We were working on a spire for the town hall. It was his dream to create lace from iron that would reach for the sky. He had calculated everything, every curl, every weld. He used to say, 'You must respect the iron, Bjorn. Don't rush it. Listen to it.' But I was young, arrogant. I thought I knew better. I invented a new bellows system with a triple draft to stoke the fire into an inferno. I thought we could heat the entire structure at once and finish the job in half the time. Master Otto forbade me. He said it was too dangerous, that a heat that intense was unpredictable. He asked, 'Do you promise you won't do it without me?' And I promised. I lied to him." He lowered his head again. "The night he left for the next town to get a special flux for the welding, I decided to try it. I was certain of my triumph. I stoked the fire. God, what a fire it was! White, blinding, roaring. For a moment I thought I had won. And then I heard a sound, a thin sound like a moan. It was the main weld cracking under the uneven heat, and the entire structure, that massive, beautiful spire, began to fold in on itself like paper. Red-hot bars tore at each other. It was like the agony of a wounded beast. It collapsed onto the wooden scaffolding. A minute later, the entire workshop was in flames. Thomas listened, holding his breath. I tried to put it out, tried to save the blueprints, but it was too late. Just then, Otto returned. He ran into the fire for his sketchbook. A beam fell right on him. I pulled him out. He was already unconscious. He survived, but his right hand was crushed, and his eye, he was blinded in one eye. My pride, my broken promise, turned the greatest master I ever knew into a cripple."
He gave a bitter laugh. "The worst part is, he didn't blame me. He said it was his own fault for leaving me alone. His pity was worse than any punishment. I couldn't stay in Weissenberg. I couldn't look him in the eye. I ran. I hid what was left of our dream, this damn fragment, and I swore I would never again try to create beauty, because beauty breeds pride, and pride leads to destruction." The room was silent. Now Thomas understood everything. Every piece fell into place. He stood up, walked to his father, and placed a hand on his trembling shoulder. "That was pride, Father," he said firmly. "But refusing Sir Kalen's work isn't humility. It's fear. You're not honoring Master Otto's memory by hiding from your gift. You're betraying him a second time. He taught you to create, but you are choosing to destroy yourself." He picked up the twisted piece of metal. "This fragment isn't a curse, it's a lesson. A terrible lesson, but it doesn't have to be your prison. The Lord's commission isn't a repeat of the past. It's a chance to make things right, a chance to prove to yourself that you've learned that lesson, to prove that you can create beauty without pride, with respect, with the wisdom you didn't have back then." He looked his father directly in the eyes. "We're starving. The whole village laughs at you. But that's not what matters. What matters is the fire in your forge has nearly gone out. Let's reignite it, together." Bjorn was silent for a long time. He looked at his son, and in his gaze, decades of fear warred with a newly sparked ember of hope. He looked at his wife, who nodded encouragingly through her tears. Finally, he looked down at his own hands, the hands of a master that had for so long done only simple, safe work. He slowly rose, walked to the table, and touched a finger to the cold, mangled metal from the chest. Then he looked at Thomas. "All right," he said, his voice heavy, the word landing with the weight of a hammer blow. "We'll take the job."
Chapter 6. Allies and Rivals. The morning after the confession wasn't a happy one. Joy is too light, too shallow a word for what they were about to undertake. The air in the house and the forge was thick with a resolve as dense as tar. It was as if Bjorn had aged 10 years overnight, but at the same time he stood taller. The weight of his secret was gone from his shoulders, replaced by a different burden, the responsibility of the promise he'd made to his son and to himself. He was no longer running from his past. He was turning to face it, hammer in hand. The first thing they did was unroll Sir Keelan's drawing on the huge workbench. Bjorn no longer looked at it with horror. Now his gaze was that of a general studying a battlefield map. He silently traced the elegant lines with a calloused finger, his lips moving without a sound. "Too many scrolls," he finally said. "The artist was thinking of beauty, not weight. If we make this from solid bars, the gates won't be able to support their own weight. They'd be ripped from their hinges within a year." He took a piece of chalk and began sketching his own designs on a slate board. He wasn't changing the drawing, no, he was breaking it down into components, like a butcher dressing a carcass. He was thinking about the skeleton, the load-bearing frame that would be hidden behind all the leafy scroll work. He calculated the stress, the weld points, the thickness of each element. Thomas watched, holding his breath. He wasn't seeing a blacksmith. He was seeing an architect, an engineer, a creator engaged in a silent dialogue with the laws of physics and the resistance of metal. By noon, the calculations were finished, and the result was staggering. "We'll need more iron than I've used in the last 5 years, Bjorn said, his voice low. "And charcoal, a mountain of it. The best kind, from hardwood oak that burns long and hot." This was the first problem. The usual deliveries from random traders wouldn't do. They needed a constant, reliable ally. "Old Hans," Bjorn said, as if thinking aloud. "He lives in the woods like a recluse. No one knows how to burn charcoal the way he does, but he doesn't like people, especially those who serve lords." The next day, they set out. The forest greeted them with a cool silence. The deeper they went, the thicker the shadows became. The air smelled of damp earth, decaying leaves, and something else, something primal and wild. Finally, they came to a clearing shrouded in a bluish haze. In its center stood a huge mound of earth and clay, with thin trickles of smoke seeping out. It was a charcoal kiln. Nearby, sitting on a stump by a small hut, was a stooped old man with a gray beard down to his waist, and small, faded eyes. This was Hans. "What do you want?" he rasped, without even turning his head. "I need charcoal, Hans," Bjorn answered calmly. "My charcoal is the same for everyone. Take a bag and leave a coin." "I don't need one bag, I need all of your bags. For the next year, your best charcoal from the heart of the oak." The old man slowly turned around.
His small eyes narrowed with suspicion. For a year? Are you planning to reforge the whole world, Bjorn? I heard you started serving the new lord. That's not for me. I only serve the forest. I serve my craft, Bjorn answered firmly. I've taken on a job that requires the best iron, the best hands, and the best fire. And the best fire is born from your charcoal. I came to you not as a lord's servant, but as one master to another. He walked over to a stack of filled sacks, untied one, and scooped up a handful of charcoal. The pieces were large, dense, with a bluish sheen. He brought them to his nose, inhaling the scent. You burn it 3 days longer than the others. That's why there isn't a drop of tar in it, only pure heat. Hans grunted in surprise. For the first time in years, someone was talking to him not about price, but about the essence of his work. You know your craft, he admitted. All right, you'll have my charcoal. Once a week, at dawn, a cart will be waiting for you by the old oak tree. But if I ever hear you've burned it on some useless trinket, the path through this forest will be closed to you forever. They shook on it. The first ally had been found. The news that Bjorn had taken on the impossible commission spread through the village like wildfire. The reactions were mixed. Some looked on with admiration, others with disbelief. But there was one man who looked on with unconcealed malice. Lars, the stonemason. The first confrontation happened when the first cart of high-grade bloom iron, ordered from a distant mining region, arrived at the forge. Lars and his cronies happened to be walking by. Well, look here, he boomed, stopping in his tracks. Our hermit has decided to play the big city master. What's the matter, Bjorn? Decided to trade your conscience for a bag of silver? Bjorn, who was unloading the heavy ingots, didn't honor him with a response. Be careful, blacksmith. Iron is heavy. You might strain yourself. Not like our noble stone. We create for eternity. You just make rust. Thomas clenched his fists, but Bjorn stopped him with a look. Pay him no mind, he said quietly, after the stonemasons had left. Dogs only bark at those who are moving forward, and we are moving forward. But Lars was not going to stop at words. A couple of weeks later, when the first batch of charcoal from Hans ran out, a cart from another, less reliable merchant arrived at the forge. Bjorn, who was busy preparing a complex piece for the gate's foundation, told Thomas to accept the delivery. The next day, they lit the forge. But something was wrong. The fire, which usually roared with a clean white flame, was now sputtering, coughing up black, acrid smoke and struggling to reach the right temperature. What's wrong with the fire? Bjorn roared, furiously working the bellows. It's sick! They placed the first piece of precious iron into the forge, but instead of heating to a white-hot glow, it was covered in some kind of greasy film, and it cracked under the first few hammer blows. The piece was ruined. In a fury, Bjorn grabbed a poker and threw the spoiled metal into the yard. He was desperate. It felt like a bad omen, an echo of the long-ago catastrophe. He was ready to believe that fate itself was against him. But Thomas, while his father paced the forge, didn't panic. He thought. He remembered Hans's words. He remembered the smell of his charcoal. He walked over to the pile delivered the day before and picked up a few pieces. They were lighter than usual, and they smelled different, of dampness and pine. He tossed one into the small forge they used for locks. The piece flared up quickly, but burned out almost immediately, leaving behind a lot of ash and a sharp, resinous smell. "Father," he shouted, "this isn't the right charcoal." He ran to Bjorn and showed him. "Look, this is pine, not oak, and it's damp. They mixed it in with the good charcoal to cheat us." Bjorn took a piece, crushing it in his fingers. His eyes cleared. It wasn't bad luck. It was deceit. Human villainy. Lars, this is his work. His father's anger was terrifying, but Thomas stopped him. "We can't prove it, but we can prevent it." That evening, showing an uncharacteristic persistence, Thomas laid out his plan. They would build a covered shed with a wooden floor against the back wall of the forge to keep the charcoal dry. And they would test every new batch before loading it into the main forge, burning one piece in the small forge first.
Bjorn listened, his brow furrowed. There was logic in his son's words. Simple, working logic. He nodded reluctantly. "All right, we'll build it tomorrow." You did good," he added, and that clumsy praise was more valuable than gold to Thomas. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. The problem with the charcoal, which had nearly ruined their work, sparked a new idea in his mind. They were dependent on the quality of the coal, on the weather, on the honesty of merchants. But what if they could create a fire that was stronger than all those circumstances? A heat that didn't care if the charcoal was oak or pine. He lit a candle and on the back of an old bill began to draw. He drew a bellows, but not a normal one, a double bellows. 2 chambers working in opposition. As one compressed, pushing air out, the other would expand, drawing it in. This would create an airflow that wasn't intermittent like theirs was now, but constant and steady. It would allow them to achieve incredible, stable temperatures. His father came into the room to get some water. He saw the drawings. "What's this newfangled nonsense?" he grumbled. "Our bellows served my grandfather, and they'll serve us just fine. Stop inventing things. Better to focus on swinging that hammer straight." He left, thinking nothing of it. But Thomas wasn't offended. He carefully hid his drawing. He understood that his father wasn't ready. His faith in tradition was his only shield after the tragedy of his past. But Thomas knew the time for his newfangled nonsense would come. When a normal fire wasn't enough, he would give them a new one, constant, furious, and untamable. A fire worthy of their great purpose.
Months went by. The forge had found a new, frantic rhythm. It would wake before dawn and fall silent long after midnight. The village grew accustomed to the constant hum of the bellows and the ringing duet of hammers. Bjorn and Thomas worked as a single organism. The silent understanding born between them had become deeper than any words. Thomas learned to anticipate his father's movements, handing him the right tool a moment before he asked for it. He learned to read the fire like a book, knowing when to unleash its fury and when to temper its heat. Bjorn's fear hadn't vanished. It lived inside him like an old ailment. But now it had been driven into the furthest corner of his soul by stubborn, daily labor. They had finished forging the load-bearing frames for both gates, a powerful, reliable skeleton capable of holding any weight. They had crafted hundreds of leaves and dozens of twisting vines, each with its own unique curve. The forge was piled high with finished pieces, and this orderly chaos was a testament to their titanic efforts. The time had come for the most difficult part, the central medallion for the right gate. It was the heart of the entire design, a scene of a deer hunt. Dozens of separate elements had to be forge welded into a single living picture. For weeks, Bjorn never strayed from the workbench, forging every detail. The thin, branching antlers of the deer, its tense muscles, the open mouths of the hounds, even the folds on the rider's hunting horn. And then, the day of the great welding arrived. This wasn't a normal workday, it was a ritual. Bjorn personally sorted through all the coal, selecting only the best, densest pieces. He relined the forge with clay so as not to lose a single drop of heat. The air in the smithy was electric with anticipation. "Ready?" Bjorn asked, and his voice lacked its usual sternness. It was filled with tense excitement. Thomas just nodded silently, tightening his grip on the handle of his tongs. They began. First, they welded the small details, branches to a tree trunk, legs to a dog's body. Each weld required the perfect temperature and precise calculation. Bjorn would snatch 2 white-hot pieces from the fire, throw them on the anvil, and Thomas would instantly sprinkle the join with borax flux, a special powder that helps the metal fuse. Then came a quick, rhythmic series of blows from Bjorn's hammer. It was magic. Before their eyes, 2 pieces of iron became one, without a seam, without a flaw. The most difficult part was the deer. Its graceful body, frozen in a leap, had to be joined with its neck and proudly raised head. This was the largest and most critical weld. Any mistake, the slightest delay, and months of work would be for nothing. They heated the pieces to a blinding, almost liquid state. "Now!" Bjorn yelled. He pulled the torso from the fire. Thomas pulled the neck and head. They brought them together on the anvil. A shower of sparks erupted. Bam, bam, bam went Bjorn's hammer. Bam, 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 Thomas echoed with a smaller hammer, compacting the weld from the other side. For a moment, they became a 4-armed deity, commanding fire and steel. Their movements were perfect, their rhythm flawless. When it was over, they staggered back from the anvil, reeling from exhaustion and tension. There, in a cloud of steam and smoke, lay their creation. The medallion was complete. They carefully moved it to a large slab covered in dry sand for a slow, even cooling. It was a triumph. For the first time in long months, Bjorn smiled. Not a crooked smirk, but a real wide smile that made the wrinkles around his eyes kind. He walked over to Thomas and placed a heavy, enormous hand on his shoulder. "We did it, son. We did it." That evening, there was a celebration in the forge. Elspeth brought them a pitcher of the best ale and fresh bread with cheese. She looked at the creation of her husband and son, and her eyes shone with pride. It seemed all fears were behind them. The family was united, their future seemed bright, and the past was finally buried under a layer of ash. The medallion cooled all through the night and the next day. No one dared to touch it. It was a sacred process. The metal had to rest, to come to itself, to find its final strength. At the end of the second day, Bjorn decided the time had come. He approached the slab. His movements were solemn. He brushed away the sand and began to inspect his creation. He ran his fingers over every scroll, every leaf, checking the strength of the welds. His face expressed complete satisfaction. The work was flawless. And then, suddenly, his hand froze. It stopped on the deer's neck at the very spot of the main weld. His smile slowly slid from his face. He leaned in closer, his pupils narrowing. Thomas, watching him, felt an icy cold crawl up his spine. "Father, what is it?" Bjorn didn't answer. He ran a fingernail over the weld. Then again, and Thomas saw it. It was almost invisible, as thin as a spider's web, a small hairline crack snaking right through the center of the weld. It was tiny, but it was there, a defect, a fatal, irreparable flaw in the very heart of their masterpiece. Bjorn made a strange, strangled sound, like a moan. He recoiled from the medallion as if from a venomous snake. All the blood drained from his face, leaving it ashen, just like that day in the castle. "No, no, no," he whispered. The ghost of Weissenberg, which they had so diligently chased away, had returned. It now stood between them in the cold forge, its icy breath freezing their blood. For Bjorn, this crack was not just a technical failure. It was a judgment from fate, a sign, a proof that he had been right. The iron had not forgiven his pride. It was laughing at him again. "I knew it," he shouted, his voice breaking. "I knew this would happen. It's because we rushed, because of these cursed patterns. I told you the iron doesn't forgive." "Father, calm down," Thomas pleaded. "We can fix it. We can—" "Fix it?" Bjorn roared. "This can't be fixed. It's a brand, a seal of failure. Next time it won't be the weld that cracks, it'll be the whole frame, and it'll fall on our heads, just like before." He was out of his mind. All his composure, all his newfound confidence had crumbled to dust. Before Thomas stood not a great master, but a broken, terrified man haunted by his demons. "That's it, enough," he said, his voice becoming deathly calm. "The work is over. Tomorrow I'm melting this disgrace into scrap. We'll tell the Lord we failed." "No," Thomas cried, rushing toward him. "We can't give up. Not now. We can try to re-weld the crack or make a decorative collar for the deer to strengthen the seam." "Silence," Bjorn commanded, his face twisting in a snarl. "You don't understand anything, you and your new-fangled ideas. This is your fault. You pushed me. You made me rush. Don't you dare touch that medallion. I forbid it." He grabbed a heavy sledgehammer and stood between Thomas and their creation, like a sentry guarding the scene of a disaster. The wall they had worked so hard to tear down had grown back in an instant, higher and thicker than before. The alliance was broken. The fragile peace was shattered. In the center of the forge, on the cooling sand, lay the magnificent but doomed medallion. It wasn't just a piece of spoiled metal. It was a symbol of their rift. The first crack wasn't just in the proud deer's neck. It ran straight through their hearts.